maybe even stopped the process for a while to get these two columns in very late in the day. So clearly it made an impression on people. But it wasn't until the next day's paper that people understood the extent of what had happened.
All emergency services in Scotland are extended to the limit right now in an effort to clean up last night's extensive storm damage. But many roads in the central belt are still blocked by fallen trees. In Edinburgh and Glasgow, hundreds of workmen have been busy clearing city streets. Masonry, roof guttering, smashed chimney stacks and road signs ripped from their posts still litter many roads.
It looked like a bomb site. It was like you were in the middle of a war. There was just rubble everywhere, chimneys down, chimney pots, just complete mayhem, just debris everywhere. Roof tiles, thousands and thousands of roof tiles off, loads of cars damaged, obviously.
I like to travel on the front seat in the top deck of a bus, and as we passed Willowbank Street, I just looked down the side road, and it looked like the building had collapsed completely. The whole building seemed to be in the street.
Nobody could quite believe how bad it was. You know, anything that was ready to go in Glasgow went that night.
When you have a wind of over 100 miles an hour in the city, quite a lot falls down.
Greenock suffered badly with many collapsed buildings and roofs blown away. One man was killed there.
Mr. Doherty, what happened to your house?
The chimney stack had fallen right in. We had moved the kids the previous Friday night because we're going to redecorate. They're very lucky they weren't killed. And the chap next door, he was killed.
A man was killed in Bonhill, Dumbarton as he drove his expectant wife to hospital. His car smashed into a fallen tree. His wife was injured, but later gave birth to the baby, and both are well. In the Gorbals area of Glasgow at this moment, 4 people are trapped in the basement of a collapsed tenement. Another 3 men are pinned beneath the upturned hull of a Clyde Port Authority dredger, the Cessnock, which capsized our Princess Pier Greenock just over 2 hours ago. Only about 6 feet of the dredger's hull is showing above the waterline.
David Bowen and his colleagues had managed to weather the storm during the night, but as dawn broke the next morning, disaster struck, while David was below decks on the barge.
There was a horrible rumbling noise, and we ran up on deck and we couldn't find the dredger. And we next day all night and we couldn't find it. And we suddenly realised it's turned turtle, it's turned over.
Unknown to the men on the 2 vessels in the Clyde, the dredger had been holed under the waterline during the storm and had been taking in water for much of the night. It turned over just before 8 o'clock and sank before anyone could escape.
And then realised a few friends were still in the dredger. We looked about, and that's when it hit us then. We lost 3 good friends.
With wind speeds of over 100 miles an hour, some buildings in the city sustained serious damage, and many people were killed by falling masonry. Hector Aitken was with a fire crew called out to attend a rescue in Glasgow's West End.
Most of the residents were out in the street, and as we pulled up, they informed that there was someone still inside the building. As we got to this area, it was very evident that everything had gone, all the windows had gone, the chimneys had gone. The actual roof was now at basement level. We went in, there was a young man, and all he would say was, my wife, and he was actually pulling main beams one-handedly, looking for his wife. We managed to coax him to go outside. 2 or 3 times people had passed what we thought was a doll's head. One of the lads had actually found that it was his wife. I mean, she was completely buried, and all that was visible was the top of her head. It was also obvious that she had died.
1968. I was 16 years old. We lived at 555 Dumbarton Road. We thought it was a regular storm. We just thought it was a windy night. We had no idea there was anything coming our way. When the storm came through, my younger sister obviously was afraid, and she went into the bedroom of my dad and stepmom, and my dad came out to check on us. That's when the chimney collapsed from the other building. A lot of banging, a lot of noise, and then there was the loudest noise that I'd ever heard. That everything collapsed from the roof down through to the lower level, and there was lots of dust, lots of panic, lots of noise going on. My father saying, get out the house. The wind was so dramatic, we were basically pushed down the road, and there was so much debris flying through the air that we weren't really sure where we were. It was kind of a blur. We ended up going upstairs to somebody's house across the street, and we were viewing the debris from that window. And my dad wasn't there, and all we saw was fire engines, ambulance, debris. And then we didn't know what had actually happened until early in the morning.
While his father spent the rest of the night searching for his wife and youngest daughter, Peter, his brother, and his oldest sister were safe in a house across the road, looking down on the scene.
When daylight appeared, I remember a police officer coming in and talking to us. So they discovered that there was 4 bodies in that debris, and my stepmom and sister were 2 of them.
Large parts of Greenock, Glasgow and Edinburgh lay in ruins. Thousands were now homeless. Hundreds of thousands of homes were now damaged.
If your windows have been blown in and you haven't been able to get anyone along to repair them, use furniture, wardrobes, anything you can get your hands on to seal the gap and make it wind and watertight. Finally, if you want any help or assistance, come along to the town hall here, and there's plenty of people here who will give you all the help and assistance that you require.
After the emergency help, attention was turned to the ominous task of repairing thousands of damaged roofs as fast as possible. Dermot Macquarie was a young man at college when he got a call from his father to help the family building firm deal with a sudden demand for roof repairs.
Really it was devastation, and rain pouring into people's houses. All the roofs were still open, they weren't even covered in tarpaulins. The filth was terrible. People were just in a dreadful state. We took every tradesman, every roofer, every carpenter, every slater, from any labour exchange that we could find. We had 750 tradesmen and labourers working in 3 separate squads. And we were working all the hours that God sent.
At first, it was thought that the roof repairs would take a few months. But it took almost 2 years. Enough time for the storm damage to bring a new perspective to a massive underlying problem.
There was very little maintenance of these big tenements. And in some cases you could go up onto a roof and you could put your hand into a sandstone chimney head and just take a handful of it away.
The city was in a sort of semi-ruinous condition often. I mean, a lot of those tenements had not been looked after very well and were kind of falling down a lot of the time. And I've got a friend who lived in one in Carrickadens who said the Great Gale of '68 was a help in this, that it kind of woke up the city to the ruinous condition of its housing stock.
Away from the finer suburbs and shopping streets, Glasgow was already a mess before the storm struck. And there was nothing unusual about the sight of broken windows, loose slates and fallen chimneys. But it wasn't just the decay and degradation brought about by poor maintenance. Glasgow's authorities had been deliberately destroying the city's housing stock for about a century before the storm struck. It was part of a continuing attempt to clear away the city's notorious problem of slum housing. But it was a record of failure, for at the time of the storm, around 80,000 people were still living in homes considered dangerous or insanitary. Glasgow's dreadful housing problem began a long time before the storm in 1968. Its phenomenal industrial growth in the 19th century expanded the size of its population way beyond the size of its housing stock.
The whole thing sort of exploded, absolutely exploded. And Glasgow went from being a medium-sized city in 1800 to one of the biggest cities in the world by 1900. I mean, you're talking about London, Paris, New York, Glasgow. Sounds like something like Del Boy Trotter would come out of it, but honestly, it was that important. Where people came across, especially the potato famine in Ireland, from the Highlands of Scotland, who came down, and they were desperate because they were escaping famine and the clearances and things like that. And so they would live anywhere, and they would work anywhere, and receive terrible wages, and they had to live in these horrible conditions because there was nothing else for them to do.
These early photographs of the streets and alleys of old Glasgow were taken around 1868, just before most of it was swept aside in the city's first attempt to bulldoze its way out of its slum problem. Around 90 acres of the centre of Glasgow, including most of its medieval and Georgian buildings, were cleared by the City Improvement Trust in favour of new tenement buildings. But even after decades of demolition, progress was much too slow for the still rapidly rising population.
When it came to the Victorian tenements, of course, then you get the great variety. You go all the way from the one-room flats for the very, very poor people, all the way up to the massive flats. For the vast majority of people, though, the whole idea of a tenement was to house as many people as possible and to make as much money as possible out of that one investment in that one tenement block.
By the year 1900, the population of Glasgow was 10 times what it had been 100 years earlier, and it was still climbing. The start of the First World War in 1914 brought another large influx of workers into the city, drawn in from munitions work in the factories. The landlords were quick to capitalise on the demand.
The private landlords wanted to put the rents up by 25% because they thought they could, because there's pressure on the amount of accommodation in the city, and they controlled 90% of that. 25% is an awful lot if you don't have very, very much. So people got together and campaigned.
By November of that year, 20,000 tenants were on rent strike. When trade unions threatened to strike as well, the government caved in, freezing rents at pre-war levels.
The rent strikes were a social phenomenon. One of the few times, I think, when social unrest has actually positively changed things.
What was not foreseen, however, was that rent control would have unintended consequences. After the First World War, local government was given a potential solution to the housing problem.
Local councils started building council housing estates for the first time, and they were very good estates.
It was the start of a 50-year period in which the city's authorities would build suburb after suburb of houses designed for the working class. By the middle of the 20th century, Glasgow's population had reached well over 1 million, making it one of the most densely populated cities in Europe.
It was a bustling city. The city centre was always crammed, always busy. Tramcars and buses were full.
It was an energetic and industrious city, but few thought Glasgow pretty.
Buildings had been so tarnished, really, with years of smoke on the buildings, and we just saw it as a city of black buildings.
And under the blanket of smog were the city's slums, and behind the blackened walls, in overcrowded, In sanitary or unsafe buildings, over 80,000 people were waiting to be rehoused. A century after the city had first tried to fix its housing problem. Former Lord Provost of Glasgow, Bob Winter, remembers that decaying buildings were then a regular sight.
Tenemental housing was in a poor state. Those of us who worked in the welfare department of the city, it would be an average about once a week. A building would collapse. Chimney would fall in, some other structural fault would occur, and the people had to be temporarily accommodated before being rehoused.
One of the reasons why Glasgow became such a dirty, shabby place is because of the rent strike. And we all cheer, and they did very well for themselves, and it was exactly the right thing to do. But the unseen consequence was a suppression of the return on investment. And so people just stopped investing in them.
The result? An increasing number of houses slowly decaying, and a reputation that spread far and wide.
So you've come to Glasgow, have you? Pretty grim, isn't it? Dirt, filth, stench everywhere.
Children play in a derelict battleground of broken-down wash houses.
No hot water, no bath, a lavatory shared by 3 families.
3 kiddies living in one room, sleeping in one bed.
Crumbling buildings that make only the crudest provision for hygiene.
The question of house accommodation is at the very root of sanitary reform, and all else is mere surface work.
For too long, daily life has been a fight against overcrowding, sickness, disease, and death.
Pictures of children playing in filthy middens became the defining image of almost every film that tried to highlight Glasgow's housing issue. It seemed that only a radical solution could solve the problem. And the corporation came up with an astonishingly bold one.
With 800 years of history behind it, Glasgow today takes a look into tomorrow as the corporation puts on an exhibition in Kelvin Hall foreshadowing the proposed new inner core of the city. A scale model, 100th full size, shows the bold outline of the Glasgow to be in sharp contrast to the city that was.
The plan, by the city's chief engineer Robert Bruce, envisaged the demolition of almost every building in the city centre.
There was an incredible optimism in the early post-war period, seriously believing that the city of Glasgow actually would have the resources to demolish almost the entire building stock and rebuild it from scratch.
There was a feeling that we would make things better and we would make a better world. And to do that, you had to destroy the old world. It was a political, philosophical, psychological thing that people wanted to do.
Modernity was symbolised by great big models of the city as it would be when they built the motorways and the high-rise flats. In fact, there was a councillor who went to Los Angeles to see what the future would look like and didn't come back saying the future is terrible, we mustn't do that. He came back saying the future looks great, lots of motorways and high-rise flats. Let's have that in Glasgow.
Inspired by the new modernist school of architecture, the Bruce plan would have flattened all but a handful of buildings in the city centre. In their place would have been an engineered city, with separate zones for housing and work, pedestrians and traffic. It was exciting, but it was also expensive, and the plan lay in the corporation's in-tray for some time. But the pressure to do something quickly to help people continued. So in the late 1950s, the city's planners and engineers came up with a modification to the Bruce plan. Some of the city centre would be saved, but large swathes of Glasgow would face demolition in what were termed comprehensive development areas. And there were 29 of them.
These are the black spots, the areas of greatest overcrowding, unsafe and insanitary buildings. And we started with the best known of all.
Which one's that?
The Gorbals and its neighbour, Hutchison Town. There you have some of the worst houses in Western Europe, and Glasgow's decided they must go.
When they designated places like Gorbals, and Townhead. Great historic areas of the city as comprehensive development areas. Their idea was, we'll build a new neighbourhood here, and it will be self-contained, modern, beautiful, clean, all mod cons, all services. And of course that's what they did.
This is one of the 29 schemes Mr. Jory pointed out on his map. New plans for the best known of all, the Gorbals in Hutchison Town. 40 out of every 100 people now there will have room to move and breathe and live.
People felt that tenements were old-fashioned, squalid, depressing, unhealthy places to live, and they were. Of course, they could have been improved and changed and modernised and everything else, but people didn't think that then, and consequently great swathes of them were just demolished.
They just did not give any credence to the fact that old buildings in Glasgow were valuable.
They were sort of pulling down really very, very good tenement buildings. There were lots of other buildings, fantastic Victorian buildings just being demolished to the new Glasgow, the new modern Glasgow.
They knocked down everything. Now, the tenements were awful. In Townhead, 75% were deemed to be unacceptable for human habitation. But they didn't just knock down the tenements, they knocked down everything. All the public buildings. And in Townhead there were some fantastic public buildings. They knocked down all the commercial buildings, they knocked down all the cinemas, all the theatres, the schools. Everything went.
The fact is that things could have been saved weren't saved, because there was no pressure group here to save them.
Some did complain, but even when visiting architects raised concerns about some of the destruction, their voices were quickly drowned out by a corporation that had now set its sights on building the most modern city in Europe.
This is the day of a second front against the insidious enemies of a free and happy society. The beachheads have been established, the order is advanced. Today the bulldozers, tomorrow the builders. Today the dust of the past, tomorrow the soaring phoenix of the future as Glasgow climbs to the skies and to a better way of life for her children.
No half measures about Glasgow housing. Everything's looking up at the Ballinlough development. On the 22-acre site are the highest residential flats in Europe. The 4,500 people will soon have a pilot's eye view of their great city and enjoy it in modern comfort. Glasgow authorities have tackled a tremendous problem boldly and with imagination.
Glasgow's futuristic plan to rehouse its poorest citizens was certainly ambitious. But it simply wasn't working, because the city just couldn't build faster than the number of houses that were becoming uninhabitable. Contrast these glossy images with this journalistic report, shot at almost exactly the same time. It looked at the desperate plight of people in Glasgow, still living in their fast deteriorating homes.
The time, 1967. The place, Nicholson Street in the city of Glasgow. The two-room tenement home of Sam Dowling, his pregnant wife and their 7 children. The Dowlings have lived in these 2 rooms for 3 years. There is no bathroom, no hot water supply. They share a lavatory with their neighbours. The children have frequent attacks of dysentery. Along with some 80,000 other families, the Dowlings are on the Glasgow Corporation housing list. They have no immediate hope of a new home. The Reverend Richard Holloway is chairman of a housing association in the Gorbals, which battles on slender resources to redeem not souls, but buildings.
If we could freeze the situation there, we might, in about 30 or 40 years' time be on top of it. But there's a wastage in the city of Glasgow, which has been estimated variously between 5,000 to 10,000 houses a year, queuing up to join the 100,000 unfit houses. So you can see that, in fact, there's a kind of worsening situation.
Ready for your bed. Come on. Oh, come on.
We can't wave a wand and freeze the situation and say, we'll get there, mate, we'll get there in 40 or 50 years. Glasgow will be a gleaming miracle land of skyscrapers and flyovers. Glasgow's housing problem is so vast that I think we need a dramatic infusion of government aid. I think that, there are no two doubts about this. If Glasgow did suffer a literal earthquake, we would then be defined as a disaster area. What we have to recognise is that Glasgow is suffering from a kind of social earthquake, that there is no evidence at all that we will get on top of this in this century unless something absolutely dramatic happens.
On the 15th of January 1968, the city was severely shaken by the biggest storm to hit Scotland in living memory. It wasn't the earthquake that Richard Holloway imagined, but it did make the city think again about its housing policy.
What we really needed was to breathe new life into things, and that I do genuinely believe that the storm brought sectors together that hadn't been together before. They realised they were all in the same boat. They realised they loved the place, and they should do something about it.
But the problems were immense. The city was building as fast as it could, but it was now borrowing vast amounts to do it. And there were questions being raised about some of the houses that people were being moved to. The experience of one young man is typical of many at that time. James Campbell was 13 years old in 1968, living in a tenement in Barlock Street, then part of the Postle Park Comprehensive Development Area. His house was one of those due for demolition.
The old style tenements here would be 4 stories high. The outside of the building would be absolutely black from years and years of soot.
The houses in James's street have long gone, and the site of his tenement is now a police station.
You'd have the close entrance, left side windows, right side windows in the bottom, and we stayed in the bottom. Our room and kitchen at that time was described as a room and kitchen.
This abandoned tenement in Postle Park is perhaps a reminder of what some buildings might have looked like at that time.
You know, it was very cramped. We never had a bath, we never had hot water. The outside toilet was always blocked, and obviously, you know, there's people that have to share it. These were basically slums, slums that we were living in.
But 50 years ago, this was the only world James knew.
These streets here were our backyard. Never mind your country mansions or anything like that, you know. Where we lived and what, it didn't matter to us. We were kids. You know, we went out and we lived in our own world. And this was my world, and this is the place that I loved the best. They were close-knit communities. They were, people knew people.
Then, in 1968, damage like this, sustained by a neighbouring tenement in Postle Park, hastened the demolition of many of the buildings in James's street. The Campbell family soon got news that they would be moving out, and that their new allocated home would be around 8 miles away, on the very edge of the city. Like tens of thousands of others in Glasgow, James's new home would be in one of the corporation's Big Four overspill housing schemes, built in the 1950s on greenfield sites close to the city boundary.
You were living in a city that was in a kind of perpetual turmoil, given that so much of it was being demolished, and given that so many people were being moved to these great estates on the outskirts, Drumchapel, Castlemilk, etc. So there was that sense of a place being remade.
One day my mother came in and announced that we would be moving to a place called Drumchapel. When we left, it was early evening and we were put into the back of Uncle's van. As we were leaving and pulling away, I was crying in the back. I felt as if I was being wrenched. Unceremoniously dragged, kicking and screaming, I would say. And I always felt that the journey, it would take forever. It just seemed we were going further and further away.
The future that lay before James was one that seemed to fix every one of his family's immediate problems. Their house would be spacious, modern, dry and clean. It would have proper sanitation, and they would have a